Okay, today we're going to take a look at the IP address counter challenge from Topcoder. Now, the IP address counter is basically just a web app that will show you the range of addresses available between one address and another, as long as the addresses are in the proper format. So if I wanted to just give you an example of what the app looks like, here we have the instructions for the user to use. Then we have a section for the lower IP address and the upper IP address. Display parameters are only in there for display. And then when we press calculate, we get the calculated number of addresses between the two. Should there be an error in an entry, say we don't put anything in, the first input is not an IP address. If the first input is an IP address and the second is not, we get the second IP address is not an IP address, or the second input is not an IP address. So there's the counter as it works. The code itself, we definitely need to do the testing. Now I did use Node Packet Manager, so npm. So if I wanted to run a test, I would just do npm test. And I'm using the Mocha and Chai libraries to test my app. So we go ahead and run the test, and we get 6 passing tests for the various tests that were run through here. Now there is one note on the app itself, and this is basically for testing purposes, and it's when I validate inputs. When I validate inputs, it validates that both inputs are a string so that I can pass the test. But because of this specific input value, the input field on the web page itself, each of those are going to come in as strings, so that test for string is kind of moot. But in order to pass the test, my algorithm had to account for those values per chance not being a string. And in the test itself, where it says it checks that the inputs are strings, the test that was built in had an IP address number in here, but that's not a valid input of any sort. It's not a float, it's not an integer, it's just kind of there. So if it's not a string in this format, it won't actually test it. So I just put in an integer to make it, or to show you that if the input wasn't a string, it wouldn't accept the input. So again, those are all the major changes. The code itself is fairly self-explanatory. I have basically a basic index HTML page, and it's just using Bootstrap, so it has container classes to make it look pretty. But other than that, it's just going to be input fields. So I have 2 input fields, here and here, and then the button field to submit or to calculate draws in the main method from the onClick from the app.js, and then just runs through the algorithm. So the main grabs the IP_min and max using document.getElement. Then it runs the IPsBetween method, which is what we have been asked to test for, and it returns the appropriate message depending on what has been sorted out through the helper methods. Okay, so the first helper method, so if we go to IPsBetween, you'll notice it calls various helper methods to actually get us going. The first is validate inputs. As I went over before, it validates the inputs are strings, which is kind of moot if we're inputting information in via the web page. But then it changes those strings to integer arrays. Basically just splits the string and then maps each of those values to an integer. So it leaves me with an integer array. Then I get the difference between the two integer arrays. So basically I'm looking at the difference between the octets, and finding the difference, I'm then able to calculate by finding the absolute value of the reduced, or the sum of those octets. And that's if the input is valid. If it's not valid, then we get returned to the has validation errors method. And so that's when it runs through and checks. It does, in fact, double check that each of those inputs is a string. Yes, I know it's a double check, but again, if this is to continuous on in the passing of the information in. It will then turn those strings into an array. If the array.length is less than 4 or does not equal 4 exactly, it's not a valid IPv4 address, and it just lets us know which one of those values was invalid. That is all then passed back to the DOM into the ID display field, which just happens to be the Jumbotron for this web app. And then we get the information that we need. All right, so there it is in a nutshell. If there are any questions, just feel free to post them in the forum on Topcoder, and I will answer them as soon as I possibly can. Again, one more test to make sure this works. And we'll test the maximum range. So we're calculating every possible address between 0000 and 255 across the boards, and there are that many valid addresses or addresses between those points. All right, again, if there are any questions, just post them in the forum. Thank you.